Welcome to the Strong AF podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Natasha Barnes. I'm a strength and rehab coach for climbers, and I blend my 24 years of expertise and experience as an elite level climber, competitive powerlifter, and rehab professional to bring you a podcast that will help you become stronger and more resilient. In this podcast, we'll talk about all things strength training for climbers. We'll also talk about climbing injuries, rehab, and why training and rehab go hand in hand. To connect, be sure to follow me over on Instagram at Natasha Barnes. To find out more about coaching or getting help with an injury, check out my website at natashabarnesrehab.com. And now, let's get to the episode. Welcome back to the Strong AF podcast. We interrupt our normal schedule to give you guys a recap of the powerlifting competition that I just did last weekend on September 23rd. I was originally going to release a strength training programming episode, and I'm still going to release that. It's just going to drop next week instead of this week because a bunch of people voted that they wanted to hear my meet recap. So we're going to get into it in this episode. Before we get into that, I'm going to talk about what powerlifting is, how a powerlifting competition works, and then I'm going to talk to you about my training for the powerlifting competition and how the competition went for me. If you're not really interested in hearing about powerlifting, this episode might not be for you, but if you're already a little familiar with powerlifting and you'd like to hear more, even if you're not familiar and you'd like to hear more, stay tuned for the episode. All right, let's go ahead and talk about what is powerlifting. So, powerlifting is a competitive strength sport where athletes train for and test their 1 rep max in the squat, the bench press, and the deadlift. The priority of training is building 1 rep max strength in these lifts within the constraints of the rules of competition and for preparing for the competition. The difference between powerlifting and general strength training for climbing is pretty big when you really look at the programming and also like what the goals are between each of those things. So powerlifting training looks a lot different, and it's focused on higher intensity lifting and choosing exercise variations that help develop the main lifts, which are the squat, bench, and deadlift, specifically for a 1 rep max test in competition. Training is also typically higher frequency for powerlifting and higher volume than it would be for strength training for climbers. There are other sports that people get confused with powerlifting. Olympic lifting is another strength sport where athletes train for and test their 1 rep max in the snatch as well as the clean and jerk. So it's 2 different lifts than the 3 lifts that you do in powerlifting, and they're more explosive. Basically, a snatch is where you bend over and pick up the bar in a deadlift position and basically stand up with it and throw it over your head. A clean and jerk is similar. You're also starting in a deadlift position, but you are cleaning the bar. So you're picking it up and catching it on your shoulders, basically. And then you are doing like a little dip, which is the jerk, and pressing it overhead. So both of the lifts, you're basically throwing the bar over your head. It's just 2 different ways of getting to that position. And that's what Olympic weightlifting is. And that sport is in the Olympics, which is why it's called Olympic weightlifting. But it's different than powerlifting. And we don't typically practice the snatch and the clean and jerk in powerlifting. So a lot of times people get that sport confused with powerlifting. So I wanted to clarify that's a different sport. I have done it before, and I've competed in 1 Olympic weightlifting meet and decided it wasn't really for me. I didn't really like how technical it was, and I also felt like I was too early in my strength training journey. I felt like I needed to be stronger, and I just haven't gone back to it. But I'm really a lot more drawn to powerlifting than Olympic weightlifting, but those are basically the differences there. There are other strength sports as well, such as strongman and Highland Games, as well as stone lifting that I know climbers are into. Those are a little bit different. They are strength-based. There's a little bit more conditioning in Highland Games and strongman competitions, And those things don't really look like powerlifting, although some of the movements can be similar to powerlifting. A lot of times they're doing some completely different things. And then, of course, stone lifting is like, picking up big stones. And you can do that locally. There's also like famous stones around the world that have been around for hundreds, probably thousands of years, actually, that people will train to go pick up. I've never done that before. It does look really fun. And I have a lot of friends who are into stone lifting and Highland Games and strongman. So maybe at some point I'll dabble in that, but I haven't yet. But those are some other strength type sports that are not powerlifting. And then another sport that people confuse with powerlifting sometimes is bodybuilding. Bodybuilding is a sport that's focused on building a muscular physique. And bodybuilding athletes are not tested on their lifts. They do lift weights, but they're not tested on their lifts. They're judged on their physique on the day of the competition, and dieting is a very huge part of that sport. So typically in bodybuilding, people are going to do a bulk where they spend a period of time in a caloric surplus building muscle tissue. And then they do pretty significant weight cuts for those competitions to get very, very, very lean. And typically that dieting is very extreme. It's definitely not for everybody. But they do it for the sport, and then they're judged on their physique. So that's a little bit different. I mean, it's very different than powerlifting, but sometimes people are like, oh, you've been doing some bodybuilding, or you bodybuild. I do not bodybuild. Of course, I do hypertrophy work as part of like my powerlifting training, especially in the off season, but I do not train for physique necessarily. Like, of course, I want to look strong and muscular, but I'm not training for bodybuilding competitions. So I'm not training for like a stage. I'm not like extreme dieting to get super lean, and then being judged on my physique. I compete in a strength sport known as powerlifting. So sometimes people get those confused, and I just wanted to clarify so that people listening to the podcast can understand the difference between those sports and what powerlifting actually is. I also have a lot of people say that they've started strength training, and often people will say, oh, I started powerlifting thanks to you. And what they're actually doing is they're just strength training. They're just resistance training. They're not actually powerlifting. I do not think that climbers should powerlift, because powerlifting is a competitive sport that you're training to test your 1 rep max. And that's not necessarily something that we need to be doing to support climbing. The goals are completely different there. And so I don't have my clients powerlift. I don't recommend that anybody listening powerlifts unless you want to powerlift. If you want to compete in powerlifting, if you're interested in powerlifting, of course, that makes sense. But most of the people listening are going to be interested in strength training for climbing. And I just wanted to clarify that I don't think climbers should be powerlifting necessarily for their sport, unless they want to be a hybrid athlete and they want to compete in powerlifting. And I do have multiple athletes who are climbers that also powerlift. And there's ways to balance that. Basically, you're going to prioritize the different sports during different seasons. And I also have athletes who are strictly powerlifters that don't climb. They just powerlift, and I help them with coaching and programming. So that is something that I do. But I wanted to clarify that like powerlifting is not something we do to support climbing. It's a completely different sport. Okay, and then let's talk about how a powerlifting meet actually works. So powerlifting is a weight class sport. So there are different weight classes. There are also different age categories, and of course it is separated into male and female categories. There's also different divisions within powerlifting. So there's different like divisions you can compete in, such as doing a full powerlifting meet where you are tested on your squat, your bench, and your deadlift. There's also a push-pull category, which is something I've done one time before, where you only train for and compete in bench press and deadlift. So there's no squat in that one. There's also bench only. So some people come to a powerlifting meet and they're only competing in bench press. And then there are other categories such as classic raw, So normally raw is just normal powerlifting. You can wear wrist wraps, you can wear knee sleeves. That's raw. You can wear a weight belt. That's all raw powerlifting. There's also classic raw, which is where people use knee wraps, which are like super stiff, super elastic wraps that people wrap tightly around their knees. And it gives you support around your knees, and it does help you lift more weight than you could do raw. And people train for that intentionally, and that is called classic raw. That's not the category that I compete in. I just compete in regular raw powerlifting, but that is one of the categories. And then there's also equipped lifting, where you can wear the knee wraps and you also wear a special squat suit. Basically, it's like a very, very, very stiff singlet that, like, if you put this singlet on, it is so tight and it is so stiff that you cannot sit down in a chair. Like, you have to have a lot of weight on your back in order to basically squat down. And people also wear something called a bench shirt for bench press in that category, which is basically like a really, really stiff shirt that supports you in the bench press. And then people wear the squat suit for deadlifts as well. But basically, the suit helps support you so that you can lift more weight. So if somebody's lifting equipped, they're typically going to be lifting a lot more weight than what you could do in classic raw or regular raw powerlifting. So hopefully that's not super confusing, but there's a few different categories. I don't compete equipped. I don't compete in classic raw. I personally just compete in regular raw powerlifting, and I don't know if I have any interest in competing in those other categories. I mean, I have tried knee wraps before, and it was really fun. I remember trying them, and I could squat like 275, like it was the empty bar, which was really fun. But at the same time, it's really uncomfortable because the knee wraps are so tight. Like my legs were going numb. Basically, my lower legs were going numb. It's pretty uncomfortable. People get used to it like after you train that way for a while, but I don't know if it's something that I'm necessarily interested in like specifically training for. But just so you all have an idea of like how powerlifting works, those are the basic categories. In a powerlifting competition, you're basically given 3 attempts to test your squat, your bench, and your deadlift. And you're just doing 1 rep in the competition for each of these attempts. And the idea is to work up to basically a 1 rep max for each of those lifts. And then what happens is they add up what you did for your best squat, your best bench press, and your best deadlift. And that gives you what's called your total. And then they use a formula to calculate basically strength to weight. So they incorporate like your weight and your total, and you're given what's called a DOTS score. Used to be called a Wilks score, but they've recently changed the formula and changed the name. It's called a DOTS score now. And that's how they decide the winner in that weight class. And then usually in a powerlifting meet, they will also award best lifter. So whoever had the best DOTS score as a female and the best DOTS score as a male will win best lifter as well for the meet. I've won that a few times at a few of the meets that I've competed at, and it's always like a big honor and super awesome because basically it means that you were the strongest person pound for pound that day in the competition. But that's basically how your score is totaled, and then they decide the winners based off of that. And of course, it's within each weight class, each gender, and each category. So typically I will sign up for open, which is just the regular category. And then I will also sign up for my age category, which I'm a master's now, which is 40 and above. Since I turned 40 this year, I'm a master's lifter, which is pretty fun that they have that age category. It's kind of nice. It's nice to compete in open because you're competing against everybody in your weight class, but for masters, I'm just competing also against people who are in my age category, which sometimes is nice because Sometimes it's in open, everybody's like 20. And it's nice to compete against people who are actually my age. Um, yeah, so that's basically how the competition works. There's some basic rules for powerlifting. So some of the general rules, like you have to wear a singlet when you compete, so that it's easier for them to judge you and judge your positioning and all of that. It's a tight singlet, so you can see your whole body basically. For squats, you have to squat below parallel. So if you squat high in a meet, it won't count. You have to squat to at least like just below parallel in most meets. You also have to pause your bench press on your chest until a judge gives you a press command. So it usually ends up being like a 1 or 2 count pause on the chest. So we train for that specifically in training because we know we're going to have to pause it in a competition and wait for a press command. It's not just a touch and go bench press. And then for your deadlift, you basically have to hold your deadlift at the top after you pick it up and wait for a down command from the judge, from the front judge, before you can set it down. There's also a couple other little things you have to watch out for. So for squats, they give you like a squat command and then a rack command, which you have to wait and listen to. Same thing for bench. They give you like a start command, a press command, and a rack command. So you have to listen for all of that. You're not allowed to just start or rack the bar whenever you're ready. You have to wait for the judge to tell you to do that. And then for deadlifts, you can just kind of walk on the platform and do your deadlift, but you just have to wait for a down command from the front judge. There's a little bit of strategy to it, and typically your first attempt in a powerlifting meet, you're going to select a weight you know you can hit for most people so that you can get on the board. Because if you don't get one of your lifts in one of the, like let's say you miss all of your squats, but you get all of your bench press and your deadlift, you're disqualified. You have to get at least one of your lifts for each of those lifts. One of your attempts for each of those lifts for the powerlifting meet to count for you so that you don't get disqualified. So people typically pick a weight they know they can do for their first attempt. So that way they have some points on the board. They're still in the meet. And then second attempt, you can push a little more. And third attempt, you can push even more or, go for a big PR or, go for a YOLO attempt. There are 3 judges who watch each of your lifts. There's a side judge on either side of you and a front judge. And each judge gives you either a white light for a past lift, meaning you followed all of the rules and completed the lift, or a red light for a miss lift, meaning you couldn't lift the weight or you didn't listen to all of the rules, or you didn't follow all of the rules. So you can miss a lift because you couldn't lift it, like you weren't physically strong to lift it, or you can miss because you didn't meet the requirements according to the rules, like squatting low enough or waiting for a rack command or waiting for a down command on your deadlift. You can get red lighted for that stuff. You must get 2 out of 3 red lights in order for your lift to pass. Also on bench press, just to mention this because this will be relevant later, your butt does need to stay on the bench in order for your lift to pass. So if you're bench pressing and your butt comes up off of the bench, it does not count in a powerlifting meet, and that's important because you can get red lighted for that. And typically if your butt comes off the bench, you're going to get 2 red lights from the side judges who can see that, and your lift's just not going to pass. So that'll come in later. Just wanted to mention that. Typically these events, these powerlifting meets last all day long, and they have everyone in the competition go through their squat first, and then they have everyone go through their bench, and then they have everyone go through their deadlift. So it's a pretty long day. Typically starts at 9 o'clock in the morning and sometimes doesn't end until like 4 or 5 p.m. in the afternoon, early evening. And so making sure that you are fueling and hydrating and all of that throughout the meet is really important. I think it's really easy to get excited and forget to eat, but if you get to your deadlift at the end of the day and you haven't eaten all day, you're probably not going to feel very good. So For powerlifting meets, we're making sure that we're eating, we're making sure that we're hydrating, we're making sure that we're resting and recovering throughout the day so that when we get to the end of the meet and we get to our deadlift, we still have some energy for that. Typically, meets are also conducted in kilograms instead of pounds, which is why you might see some weird numbers like 170.7 or 342.7 pounds instead of like 170 pounds even or like 340 pounds even. It's because the meet is conducted in kilograms and we're converting to pounds just because that's what we understand. But it's typical for meets to be conducted in kilograms. So you either have to know kilograms as well or you have to have a conversion chart. Typically, they'll have a conversion chart at the powerlifting meet. So that way, if you're not used to lifting in kilograms, you kind of know what weights you're selecting and around what it should be. I definitely train in kilograms because I like to train how I compete and I like to be a little bit familiar with kilograms. And also for deadlift, the kilo plates, if you guys have seen my lifts on Instagram, you'll notice that the plates that I use are actually quite thin. So those are calibrated kilo plates that are used in competition. They're calibrated, so they're exactly accurate. So you know exactly what you're lifting. Normal weight plates at the gym, like bumper plates and metal plates, can be off a little bit by, a few ounces or like even a couple of pounds sometimes. Like we've had weight plates at our old gym that were technically 45-pound plates, but when we weighed them on the scale, they were actually like 48 or 47 pounds. So with calibrated plates, it's nice because you know what you're getting. You're getting the exact weight. And then so you've seen them, they're really thin, but they're actually very, very heavy. And there are the big plates are basically like the red 20 kilo plates, the red 25 kilo plates, the blue 20 kilo plates, yellow 15 kilo plates, green 10 kilo plates, and like white 5 kilo plates. And then there's like some smaller change plates that are typically used. So for me, I try to do all of my training in kilos just to get prepared for that at the powerlifting meet. And then also for the deadlift, because the plates are so thin and because we use a deadlift bar in competition, which is a longer bar that has a smaller diameter, pulling the slack out of the bar, picking up a deadlift bar definitely feels different with the kilo plates than it does with like pound plates or bumper plates. And so I will typically practice with kilo plates because I want to get really familiar with that feeling of pulling the slack out of the bar and how different that feels. I try not to train with bumper plates or anything like that anymore because it's helpful to have it feel the same in training as it does in a competition. And then there are different federations for powerlifting. I will typically do USPA and now WRPF. The last competition that I did was WRPF, which is a newer federation. It was my first competition competing with WRPF. The difference being, at least in this competition, instead of squatting out of a normal rack, we squatted out of a monolift, which is a type of rack where you don't have to walk the weight out. So you don't get under the bar and then like walk out like you would with a normal weight and get into position. You get under the bar, you get your feet exactly where you want them for your squat, and then you just stand up and somebody moves the hooks out of the way. Like the hooks actually swing out of the way so that you can do your squat. And then when you stand up at the top, somebody swings the hooks back in so that you can set the bar back down on the hooks. And I've been practicing. I have like a monolift attachment that I've been practicing on in training. And I really like it actually because you don't have to spend any time walking out. And for me, it's really nice to be able to just get super tight, get under the bar, stand up, and the hooks are out of the way and you're ready to squat. Whereas when you're walking it out of a rack, I feel like for me, there's time to kind of like feel, because you're walking it out, you can kind of feel how heavy the weight is. You can like get loose. You have more time to kind of overthink it a little bit. I'm really, really liking squatting out of a monolift because you just get your feet exactly where you want them. You know they're exactly where you want them. You stand up, you're already nice and tight, and you're already ready to squat. I've been really, really enjoying that. So I like that this federation uses a monolift for the most part. In this last competition that I did, we also used what's called a squat bar, which I am not accustomed to. So it's a thicker bar. It has a larger diameter, and that's mainly because when people are squatting really, really heavy, like I'm talking like, I mean, this probably happens at like 500 plus, but it really happens at like 600 plus, 700 plus, and above. And there was somebody squatting like in the mid 800s. Yeah, somebody squatting 800, I think 840 or 870 maybe. I don't know, something insane. Very strong human. When the weight is that heavy, if the bar isn't super thick like that, there can be some whip, meaning when that person unracks the weight, there's going to be the bar can bend a little bit and you can feel a little bounce when that happens. And that can really throw you off at that much weight. So having a monolift and then having a thicker squat bar where you don't have to have that bend happening in the bar can be really, really helpful when it's heavy. Doesn't really affect me. I'm not lifting heavy enough to like have much whip in the bar, but it did take a little getting used to because I'm not used to having that thick of a bar on my back. And the markings on the bar are slightly different as well. So I wasn't 100% sure where to put my hands, but we made it work and it was fine. So I don't know if every WRPF competition uses a squat bar. I think it was just maybe this one. I know that they definitely do it for men. I don't know if they typically do it for women in other WRPF meets, but in this one we all used the squat bar. So that was a little bit different, but so far I'm really enjoying competing in this federation. So I'll probably do some more meets with them. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about my training for the meet. So this meet was actually my third sanctioned meet that I've done, probably my fourth meet total in 2023, which is a lot of meets actually. Not generally recommended to do that many meets in 1 year because it is pretty taxing and, it takes quite a bit of prep to prepare for these meets. It's not like something that you would typically, know like a month in advance and start training for it. We're typically training like at least probably like 3 weeks, or sorry, not 3 weeks, 3 months in advance for. So I've done quite a few meets this year. I love competing, so that's not a problem for me, but the intensity of the training, it is helpful to have an off season, which I'm probably going to take a nice long off season and probably have at least 6 months off for my next competition, if not more. We'll see. I always say that and then I get excited to sign up for something because I love competing and I also just kind of love having something to train for on the horizon in my lifting. I think it just gives me a little like a sense of purpose and excitement for my training. So for me, it's nice to have a meet on the horizon, even if it's like months out. But basically, we figured out this year that me and my coach figured out that my lifting was actually responding really well to an atypical kind of like preparation for powerlifting. So typically for powerlifting, you're practicing lots of heavy singles. You're doing lower repetition training at higher intensities, especially as you get closer to the meet. You tend to hit more singles. You tend to get even more specific. So even lower reps, even higher intensities. My squat and my deadlift were both responding really well to higher repetition training. So I was doing sets of 10, like 3 months out, and then transitioned to like sets of 8. And I was doing sets of 8 for a while, and my squat was blowing up. So I think doing a little bit of like that hypertrophy style, higher rep training was really, really working for me. And then we started doing some triples at RPE 7, which is an intensity where you would have 3 more reps left in the tank before failure. So lower intensity, that's not typical for a lot of powerlifting training. And I was responding really well to that, and singles at RPE7, followed by volume at like at sets of eight, at like 70%, maybe a little higher than that, depending on the lift. Yeah, it was really weird. My body was just like really, really responding to that. And yeah, my squat took off. So typically I'm training 4 days a week for powerlifting. So I train Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays. I also do some what we call GPP work. We've talked about GPP on this podcast before. GPP work for powerlifting is different than GPP work for climbing. So strength training is GPP work for climbing, but in powerlifting, GPP work is a little bit of extra like upper body, arm accessory work, maybe some core work, some cardio work, that kind of stuff. So I'm also doing 2 days a week of GPP for powerlifting. This year, one of my big goals was to put more mass on my upper body, because I knew I was going to need more muscle in order to hit the bench goals that I have for myself. So I've been really focused on that. And, I feel like you get so used to seeing your body in the mirror. I feel like this whole year I've been like, man, why isn't my upper body growing? But recently I compared how my arms look now to how they were looking a year ago, and my arms are significantly bigger. So that was really encouraging. But I would like them to get even bigger. So we're definitely going to work on that. I definitely need to put on more mass in my upper body, which is going to help me with more, the more muscle you have, the more strength potential you have. And with the bench press goals that I have, I'm going to have to put more mass on my upper body. So I'm going to continue to do that. But we've been working on that for my upper body as well. And I really committed this year to not skipping any GPP. GPP can kind of feel optional sometimes, and especially with all of the strength work I'm already doing, it's easy for me to be like skipping my GPP. But this year I've been really good. I've hardly missed any GPP sessions. Yeah, my arms are definitely bigger. But yeah, just so you guys have an idea, like the way that I train for powerlifting, I'm doing a lot more frequency. So we're talking about y'all doing like 1 or 2 days a week of strength training. I'm doing 4 days a week of strength training plus 2 days a week of GPP, which is like 2 extra days of like upper body accessory and cardio. So it's a lot more training than what we're talking about having y'all do for strength training for climbing. I'm also doing a lot more volume. So typically I'm doing anywhere from like, I want to say like 4 to 7 sets, depending on the lift. So that's a lot more volume than what we're talking about having y'all doing. So it's a lot more intense training for powerlifting than what we're doing for climbing, but that's what you kind of need if you really want to push your strength levels and you're competing in a sport where you're being tested on your strength. You have to put a lot more work into it to really maximize. Remember, the prescriptions that we were talking about, especially in the last episode, are great for health. They're great for GPP and supporting climbing, but they're not as great for maximizing strength. And since I'm competing in a sport where we're trying to maximize strength, we're doing a lot more volume, we're doing a lot more frequency, and it really works. And because I've been training for so long, I've been powerlifting since 2013 probably, or right around there. So like 10 years. My training age for powerlifting is a lot older than a lot of people probably listening to this podcast who are just starting strength training for climbing, or who strength train to support their climbing. So I actually need a lot more volume and frequency in order to make my strength improve, because I've kind of hit a plateau with the bare minimum and I have to start doing more, especially for upper body movements. So for example, in your strength training program, you might be bench pressing once a week. Maybe some of you are bench pressing twice a week. I actually have to bench press 5 to 6 times a week in order to get my bench press to go up and get stronger. And so what that means is on some of these sessions, I'm bench pressing twice in one training session. So sometimes that might look like a competition bench followed by some kind of accessory bench. So like maybe a close grip bench or an incline bench or a feet up bench or something like that. That means a lot of my sessions I'm benching twice in one session because I need 5 to 6, not necessarily 5 to 6 days of benching, but 5 to 6 slots of benching in order to get my bench press to move. So hopefully that gives you guys some perspective on the strength training that you should do for supporting your climbing versus the strength training that you would need to do to maximize your strength levels, especially at an older training age. Yeah, we really did figure out some good stuff for my training. And like I said before in one of the other podcasts, like everybody responds a little bit differently to training programs. And so it does take a little bit of experimentation to figure out what works for you. And also what works for you is going to change over time too. And it seems like right now for me doing a sort of like a power building, almost like a bodybuilding / powerlifting hybrid style of programming is seeming to work really, really well for me at the moment. So we figured out some great things, and I basically had probably the best meet I've ever had to date, which is awesome, which we'll talk about it in a second. So like I said, weight training or powerlifting is also a weight class sport. So in the this last year, so probably since March, I decided to increase my body weight. So I decided to do a bulk because I had the goal of building my upper body and building more muscle in general to get stronger for powerlifting. So I decided to gain some weight in order to support that. So if weight talk is triggering to you, you might want to fast forward through this part of the podcast. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but I am going to mention body weights and things like that. So if you don't want to hear about that, feel free to fast forward a few minutes. But probably in January, I was on the smaller side for me. I was probably hanging around, actually January through March, I was hanging around at about 134 pounds. Sometime in February, I actually got sick. And I didn't have COVID. It was something else. But I got sick. I got really sick and I had zero appetite. I was trying to force feed myself and I could not keep weight on, and somehow dropped a bunch of weight and ended up being like 129 pounds, which is like the lightest I've weighed in probably 10 years. And it felt horrible. I felt so small. I felt like a strong breeze could blow me over. I felt like if I got mugged, someone could easily hurt me. I did not like it. So worked really hard to get back to my normal weight. And then after that, I decided to actually gain some additional weight. So got back up to like my 134, 135 that I was hanging out at, and ended up bulking up to around 150 pounds. The weight class I compete in, sometimes I will compete in, I have competed in the 60 kg weight class, which is technically 132 pounds. And I've done some stuff to get down to that weight class for competition before. I did that in March. But for this competition, I wanted to compete in the 67.5 weight class, which is basically 148 pounds. So was hanging out a couple pounds over what I needed to weigh leading into this meet. Normally you can just, not eat quite as much for a couple of days, or, water load and then drop the water and lose a couple of pounds. But I was a little worried about that because of where I am in my menstrual cycle. I was in a point in my menstrual cycle where my body likes to hold on to water weight. So I was worried that I wouldn't make the weight class that I wanted to compete in. So we did a little water cut, which I don't necessarily want to talk about the details of on here because it's literally only a strategy used for weight class sports. And I don't want to talk about it here because the next thing I know, I'm going to hear about climbers doing a water cut to try to send their project. And I do not recommend it. So water cuts are something that you can use for a weight class sport, particularly if your weight class sport is 24-hour weigh-ins, which for powerlifting it is. So you weigh in 24 hours before you compete, which means you have those 24 hours after to rehydrate, refuel, all of that kind of stuff. So basically what you do is you increase your water, you increase your salt, and then a couple days before weigh-ins, you cut all of it out, and your body basically like pees out all the water, and you basically lose a bunch of water weight, which also means that you can lose glycogen that's being stored in your muscles. So it's not a great strategy for performance. Like I would never, ever, ever recommend someone do that to go send a climb or anything like that, because after a water cut, you feel really depleted. You do not feel good. And you can probably get injured really easily. You could cramp up. It's not good, but you do it, you weigh in, you make your weight. I ended up weighing in at, I weighed 150 pounds, and then I ended up weighing in at 146.6, which is under what I needed to be. I needed to be 148.8, I think is the cutoff. So weighed in a couple pounds under, and then spent the whole rest of the day hydrating, eating a bunch of salt, eating a bunch of carbs, eating all day. And by that evening, I weighed 155 pounds on my scale from rehydrating. So that was good. And then we did the competition. So the competition was great. It was at Nightmare Muscle Gym, which is in Sacramento. Thanks to those guys for putting that great meet on. It was an awesome event. And I ended up squatting 330 pounds, which is a 10-pound all-time PR and a 10-pound meet PR. So it's 10 pounds more than I've ever squatted in my entire life. And also 10 pounds more than I've done in competition, which is sometimes people will have like a PR that they've hit in the gym. And then, that might be a different number than what they've hit in competition. Like sometimes people will just be able to lift more in competition because adrenaline, you're peaked, all that kind of stuff. For other people, if they, have a hard time under pressure or with performance, sometimes their gym PRs are higher than like their meet PRs. So this 330 pound squat was like the most I've ever squatted in my entire life. I attempted a 342.7 squat for my third attempt at the meet and missed it. I think I could have gotten it, but I went into the meet like really prioritizing squats. Squats were going the best out of my whole meet prep. And after I hit my 330 squat, it was like, okay, I did what I came here for. And it was like adrenaline dump. Like by the time I got to my third squat, I was like, I did not care anymore. Like mentally, I was kind of over it because I did what I came here for, So the 342.7 just kind of felt like extra credit, like would be cool, cherry on top if I got it. But because I approached it that way instead of with like some intensity, with like, I have to get this kind of attitude, I just couldn't do it. But based on how quickly 330 moved in the competition, I knew that 342.7 was probably there and that I could do it. So I actually went into training today, and I wasn't programmed for this, but I decided to do it anyway. I went into the gym and hit 342.7 at the gym, and I think it would have counted at the competition. It met competition standards. It felt really good. It felt like I actually had a little in the tank after that too. So I went ahead and attempted 353 basically, and almost got it. Like, it seems like it's probably going to be there the next time I compete, which is really exciting for me because my last meet in March when I was lighter, I was also more stressed out. There was just like some life stress happening at that time. I failed 303 at that competition. And my first squat at this most recent meet was heavier than that. It was the heaviest I've ever opened at. I opened at 314, so I'm really, really, really happy with how squats are going. I think gaining weight was definitely the move. I'm feeling way stronger. Like, I literally cannot believe that I basically squatted 30 pounds more at this meet than I did at my last meet. Maybe more than that. And then hit an all-time PR today in the gym. So that was really cool. I'm very happy. Can't wait to build on that, and would love to hit 353, which is what I attempted. It's also really shocking to me because that's what I opened with on my deadlift. So it's really shocking to me that my deadlift and my squat are this close together. Like, that number 353 is actually, like, it's challenging for me to deadlift, let alone squat. So pretty mind-blowing to me that I'm able to squat that. And I'd like to hit that at my next meet, if not a little bit more. I think it would actually be really fun to hit like 363, because that would mean there would be 2 reds and 1 blue on the bar, which just looks really cool at my next meet. So we'll see if we can do it. But like I said, I do not plan to compete for probably at least 6 months. I think I need a nice long off season after doing so many meets this year, but really, really happy with how that turned out. For the bench press at the meet, my shoulder, I've been having some off and on problems with my shoulder since April. My bench had been going really well. I was benching 182 pounds consistently in training. My meet PR is 187 pounds, and I have hit 190 pounds in training before. And I really want to bench press 200 pounds. But I went climbing in April and had a climbing session that wasn't actually that difficult. I probably did not warm up as much as I should have, but it didn't necessarily feel like a problem at the moment, or in that moment in that session. I don't remember specifically doing anything in that climbing session, other than climbing on some steeper walls. I do remember like reaching into this undercling with like a really weird shoulder position. It kind of like one of those moves where you have to reach up into an undercling and like pretend to hold the undercling while you walk your feet over before you can fully load it. And I think it was a really weird position for my shoulder. It felt okay in the moment, like nothing hurt, nothing popped, nothing felt bad immediately after. That's the only thing I can think of that might have been weird. Only tried like 2 more things after that weren't like too shoulder intensive. And then the following day, I just had like a weird strain feeling in the front of my shoulder, the top of my shoulder. And it kind of felt like one of those things that, like, sometimes you just do a hard shoulder move and your shoulder's a little sore for a couple of days. Typically for me, if I go back to powerlifting and I do some bench pressing or overhead pressing or something, that will usually kind of like reset it or like rehab it in a way, and it feels fine. And it kind of felt like it was going to be one of those things, but it just proceeded to sort of like get worse and worse and worse. Yeah, it's just sort of been off and on bothering me in training. Some days it is totally fine, and I can bench really heavy. Other days it's just feeling uncomfortable and weak, and when it's feeling like that, I'm not able to push through it. Like, my body will start compensating, the bar will start helicoptering, like weird stuff happens. It never gets to the point where it hurts so bad in training. It's just like my body just starts compensating and I can't force myself to stay in the correct position, and like things get all squirrely. And so some days will be like that. So this whole prep bench has been sort of like up in the air. I didn't know what was going to happen. It was getting a little worse right before the meet. And so I decided to open pretty conservatively at this meet, and I opened at 160, which is pretty light for me. I've repped that plenty of times in training before. And then I ended up working up to 176 pounds at this meet, which is not a meet PR. I've hit 182 like multiple times in powerlifting meets before, and I've hit 187 in a meet before. So nothing big on bench press at this time, but I definitely want to keep working on my shoulder, keep working on my bench press training. I would really, really love to bench 200 pounds, and I would really love to bench like 100 kg, or which is 220 pounds, or like 225, which is like two 45-pound plates, just because it's like a fun goal that looks cool. And if I can bench that, I can probably bench more than a lot of men, which would be really fun. So that's my goal. But at this meet, I hit 176 pounds, which happened to be a state record in the WRPF. My squat was also a state record in WRPF for masters, which I'm really excited about. And then for my deadlift, I also hit a state record. I hit 380 pounds at the meet, which was a meet PR. So it's 5 pounds more than I've ever done at a meet. Deadlift is a little weird for me. It's typically my best lift. In this meet prep, it was probably my second best lift. It was going well, but not as well as squats. And deadlift tends to be a little weird for me in powerlifting meets because it is my best lift, but sometimes I don't perform as well at the meet, and that's typically because it's at the end of the day at the meet. So not only are you hitting a 1 rep max squat on the same day, but you're also doing that at like 9 o'clock in the morning, and then you're not deadlifting until like 2 or 3 p.m. in the afternoon. And by that time, you've been sitting around at the meet for a really long time. And my performance is typically not as good at the end of the meet. So, sometimes it's hard to know what the right calls are for deadlift. For this one, I feel like I made the right calls. I felt like I left a little bit on the platform. Like I hit 380. It was heavy, but it wasn't like, it looked like I had a little more in the tank. So kind of wish I would have gone for like 385, which would have matched my all-time PR, or 390, which would have been a PR. I've been I've been within like striking distance of a deadlift PR, and close to maybe hitting 400 before in meet preps before. Like I've hit 380 for a single at RPE 8, which means I have 2 more reps left before failure. So, 380 has felt easy for me before in meet preps, and I felt like I was going to hit 400 at those meets, and I haven't done it yet. So, I would really like to do that, and I'm going to try to work on that. I've also played around with the idea of signing up for deadlift only at the meet so that I can prioritize my training for the deadlift and not get as tired for the deadlift from squatting and bench pressing, and just going for like a deadlift PR at a meet. That would be fun to do. So maybe I will do that. I'm not sure. I do like competing in full meets better, but that's also an option. So that's how the meet went for me. And that was also a state record for masters. So, other than my bench press, these were like all-time best performances. Obviously my squat was an all-time PR. My deadlift was a meet PR. So yeah, probably the best performance I've had ever, in a powerlifting meet. So it went really, really well. And right now I'm still kind of riding high on that. I am really excited to compete again, but I know that like I'm really going to benefit from like a nice long off season, to kind of rebuild. I'd like to do a little bit more climbing. I haven't been climbing much this year. I was climbing more last year. And feeling pretty strong on the climbing wall, like climbing like V9s pretty regularly. And then this year rolled around and I wanted to focus a little bit more on my powerlifting goals. And people always ask me, like, how do you balance both? Like, how are you good at both? It's possible for me to train at both, but they do have a little tiny bit of interference on each other for me. I'm used to training as much as I train for powerlifting. So if I ease into climbing 1 day a week and then, slowly bringing that up to 2 days a week, I can do pretty well with that. But sometimes climbing gets me injured, like the shoulder injury, which doesn't even bother me climbing anymore. It literally only bothers me on bench press. And also it does take a little bit of energy from me, at least for my upper body. So I decided to not do as much climbing this year and prioritize my powerlifting training. But after this meet, I'm excited to start reincorporating climbing again. we'll see how into it I get. I feel like a lot of that has to do with like whether or not I have climbing partners and how psyched I can get. But I'd like to at least climb one time a week. I also have like a TB2, tension board 2 in my backyard, which I upgraded to last year, and I've literally only had one session on it. So I would like to have more sessions on that and take advantage. So planning on doing a little bit more climbing as well in this off season. So we'll see how that goes. But I love powerlifting. I don't plan on stopping powerlifting like ever. I don't think I will ever like completely focus on climbing and not powerlift. I could see myself, going down to like 3 days a week of powerlifting and in order to do a little bit more climbing, but I do not see myself completely phasing it out to focus on climbing, because I don't think I have to, and also because I love powerlifting too much and I don't want to do that. Those of you who know my story, you know how much powerlifting has changed my life. And if you don't, you can go listen to some other podcasts that I've been on where I've talked about that pretty much on every podcast that I've been on. But it's really important to me. I love being stronger. I love the way that it supports me. I love the way that it supports my climbing. I love how kind of like body neutral and body positive powerlifting is. Like that's one of the biggest things that I noticed when I started powerlifting is that it's very like body neutral / body positive. And that was really important for me for getting out of that like mental struggle of like that we all face in climbing of like wanting to be smaller, to increase our performance. It really helped shift me out of that and shift me out of worrying about getting bigger, and getting stronger for climbing. And I have no regrets, because I can still climb really, really hard at a lot heavier of a body weight, and I'm enjoying my life. I'm less injury prone. I don't get injured as much. I know I have a shoulder injury right now, but it's more like a tweak, and I can still climb and it's fine. But I definitely do not get injured as much as I was when I was only climbing and when I was staying very, very small. And as someone whose body weight has fluctuated a ton, and I continue to manipulate body weight occasionally, I'm like in a place where I can do that and it's not disordered and I don't feel uncomfortable. I don't ever fall into a pattern where I'm restricting myself anymore. So I feel totally comfortable manipulating like my body weight all the time. I will tell you, I perform better, I have more energy, and I feel better when I'm heavier. Like it's nice to be on the lighter side because you look, I can see my abs, I look leaner, but I do not perform as well when I'm heavier. I do not feel as good in my training. I do not make as much progress in my training when I'm a little bit heavier. So I literally have no regrets. But yeah, like I said at the beginning of the podcast, I have tons of clients who powerlift. So if you're somebody who wants to if you're a climber who wants to get into strength training, let's work together. My foundational strength training program is for you. I also do one-on-one coaching for strength training and climbing training for climbers. If you're a climber who is interested in powerlifting, I'd love to work with you. I have several athletes who are hybrid athletes. They're climbers and powerlifters, and I've got a bunch of my athletes competing in November at a powerlifting competition we're having at my gym. If you are a powerlifter, I also work with athletes who are only powerlifters and not climbers. I'd love to work with you too. So if you're interested in that, reach out through Instagram, reach out through my website, or just check out my options on my website, book in a coaching discovery call, and we can talk. But yeah, that's all for this episode. Thank you for listening. If you guys stuck with me all the way through the end here, I really appreciate you. This was my little meet recap. I feel like I could have said a little bit more about the meet, but that's the basic overview. We had a really good time. I had the best meet performance to date in my life, and I can't wait for the next one. So thanks for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode where we're going to be talking about programming strength training for climbers. There's going to be all kinds of juicy information in that episode. So I will see you there next Tuesday.